Months ago, Pam and I and Kieran ended up watching a movie, and the movie was called Uncharted. And if you haven't seen it, it really is kind of this action adventure movie that is like a historical treasure hunt, where the main characters find clues and that leads them to a treasure and yada, yada, yada. There's bad guys and all that fun stuff. And you know what? It was an entertaining couple of hours to watch. And the reason I bring it up is not that I'm recommended you go watch the movie, which you can, but the reason I bring it up is the title of the movie kind of grabbed my attention, Uncharted. Like just that title alone kind of gives you this idea that, things are adventurous, that there's this unknown, there's this wildness, this life that most of us don't even know, but we wish we could step into. The dictionary definition, literally, of uncharted refers to geography, right? It refers to an area that hasn't been mapped or surveyed. And so like it's a place that no one has gone before. That's the idea. And so basically it means that if something's uncharted, you can't just call up Siri. You can't just go, hey, Google, give me the directions to. There are no directions. You're on your own, right? Like it is you and what's before you. That's it. That's Uncharted. And Uncharted also gives us kind of this little bit of feeling where when we talk about going into the uncharted, it's like venturing into something that is unfamiliar, even unknown. And when we talk about that, it's like there's a bit of scariness. There's a bit of curiosity. There's a lot of what we wish we could know. Like we want to go into this, we think, right? And in many ways, when you stop and think about it, life is really this grand adventure into the uncharted. Our parents, mentors, people older than us can tell us about what life is going to be like. They can be models for us about how to live our life. But here's the reality of it. They can give you as much direction and much advice as they want, but only you can live your own life. Only you can navigate the path before you. Until you experience what it is like to fall in love, you don't know. Until you are in a marriage and you have to make it work, you don't know. People can talk to you about it, but until you experience it, you really don't know. And so in many of our own experiences in life, the way we live life is uncharted. Like you don't know what it's like to sit down and do a job interview until you do it. You don't know what it's like to have to live on your own and support yourself until what? You do it, right? So that's kind of like our lives are uncharted. And no matter how good our parents are, no matter how good of mentors we have, life really is uncharted. We have to step out into the unknown. We have to experience it ourselves. We have to live it ourselves, which I think if we're honest, oftentimes that scares us. It is scary to step into the unknown. It is scary to step into the uncharted. And we would much rather live in the familiar. We would much rather live with what we're comfortable in, right? Because the familiar is comfortable. And I think this in part explains some of our difficulty over the last couple of years. Like no one had ever lived through a pandemic, and yet we were all forced to do it. No one could tell us what it was like. We could look at like historical records and hope and think about what they wrote about decades ago, but no one who was alive had gone through it. And so we were all called into this moment of unknownness. We had to chart our own course in the uncharted. And we did it. We did it. We all jumped into it. We had to step into the unknown together, and we did it. But then guess what? We actually got used to it. How did it feel when you were allowed to go back into a grocery store and you didn't have to wear your mask anymore? It felt uncomfortable, didn't it? I didn't want to wear my mask, but those first few times of actually not wearing it and others still wearing it, in the store, made me feel a little uncomfortable. Like, it was weird. Like, I don't know how to interact with this, right? It was weird to go into that. And so it was like every time we go into something new, even if it's going back to something we knew before, it is uncomfortable. And here's the other thing. When we launch into the uncharted, when we go into the unknown, especially when we're first starting at it, the pull is always to go back to what we've just left. Right? So when you're just starting into that uncharted space, that uncharted area of our life, we use phrases like, I wish we could go back to normal life, or I wish we could go back to how we used to live. I mean, even now, we use that phrase for like pre-2020, right? I wish we could go back to when it was like that. Or remember when it was like that? Those are all signs that we're living in an uncharted environment because we're pulling back on what we used to do, what we felt comfortable with. I mean, we're still living in an era where we're having supply chain issues. Like Pam and I, returning from Greece, the missions trip from Greece, we had a layover in an airport in Montreal, and we were eating lunch, and I've never had this happen to me before. The server came to us, served our meal, and they had some syrup with it, right, for what we were eating, and they were in packets, and he said to us, hey, if you have any unused syrup packets, can you give them back to me, because we're running short. Like, in 2019, you would never have a server come to you and say, hey, whatever packets you don't use, give them back to me, right? We would just throw them out. We would leave them on our plate. They would clear the table and throw it out. Like, times have changed. It's a weird life we are living on some level, isn't it? We want to go back to the familiar because when we're in the familiar, we are in the comfortable. What do you do to maintain that presence of comfortability in your life? I have a bad habit of keeping clothes past their expiration date. Like sometimes the collars on my shirt are a little bit ragged. They really should be thrown out. And I remember when I got married, I had a pair of sweatpants from Trinity Western, and they had a big TWU on my butt. Like this was like the first time that clothing came out with like lettering on your butt. And I had a pair of that. And I remember like 10 years after we were married, I still had those sweatpants because they felt comfortable, even though they had a few holes in them. They were a little ratty, and Pam goes, Brent, it's really time to move on. Get rid of that. But there are things in our life that make us feel comfortable, like those ratty sweatpants, and we want to hold on to them. We don't necessarily want to go into the unchartedness of life. But here's the truth. You can't really live life without venturing into the uncharted. And so right now I want to look at two stories out of the Bible that I think help us understand what it takes to live life in the uncharted, to live life when we might be scared, when we have to step into the unknown. And it's two stories of the nation of Israel. And the first one I want to look at is in Numbers chapter 13. And I'm going to title this style of living called wilderness living. And when we are in wilderness living, the Israelites were called to go into the promised land. They were called to go into the uncharted. So let me just read the first couple of verses of Numbers 13. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am given to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. And then it goes on to list their names. So just kind of give you a context. The nation of Israel had been slaves in Egypt, and God had rescued them miraculously out of Egypt. And they had crossed through Egypt, through the Red Sea. God had divided it, and now they had gone through some desert, and they were just about to the promised land, the land that God had promised their ancestors. And so they're sitting there ready to go up in it, and they send the spies because they had never gone that way before. Right? I think about this, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and even Joseph had lived in the promised land. But now it's 400 years later. There's no one alive that had lived there. And so they are being asked to go into this place where they had never been. And so, using good leadership, they send the spies into the land to figure out what the land looks like. And they go in, and then the spies come back, and this is what they say. And this is found in verse 26 of Numbers 13. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They had brought back like grapes and all sorts of things to show the people. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. And then there's this word, but. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We saw descendants of Anak there, giants basically. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Wow. What a report, eh? Like they start off glowing about how good the land is, and then you hit verse 28 and that but and everything that follows after that but. Powerful people, fortified cities, large cities, tall people, lots of people. You see, the psychologists call this, what happened here, the power of bad. And what psychologists say is that, simply put, our brains are wired to give more importance to negative events than to positive events. And so bad events influence our decision-making more than positive ones do. That means no matter how much we want to succeed, avoiding bad events can easily become our primary goal. And so you have here this fear of the unknown, and it causes these spies to focus on the negative of what they saw, and they can't even look at the positive. And so 10 of the 12 spies that go into this land let fear rule their lives, and they convince the rest of the nation, the rest of the people, that stepping into God's promised land for them was too risky, and it wasn't worth it. And you see this in chapter 14. Here's one of the things I just want to point out to you. Leaving the desert is harder than you think it is. Leaving the desert is harder than you think it is. Like, we know the desert's not a great place to be. Like, when you think of the comparison, they were in the desert, hot, living in tents, and they were looking at a land that was flowing with their term milk and honey. It was abundance there. There was food. It was an amazing place to live. And you'd think that comparing the two, that it would be an easy choice. But it wasn't. Because sometimes, no matter how bad it is, people will often choose the charted course over the uncharted. They will choose what I know to what could be, or the unknown. If you keep reading in chapter 14, it actually tells us that they cry out that they should go back to Egypt, go back into slavery. It would be better to be slaves where there is no future, where there is no freedom, than to go into the promised land that God was calling them into. I mean, before we judge the Israelites too much, sometimes we are in the same position. We are in the wilderness. We're in a desert. And it's really actually harder to leave than we think. That's why you're stuck at your dead-end job. You know, the fear of stepping out and starting something on your own or going to a new place is just too much, and you're willing to put up with a dead-end job. That's why you put up with that girlfriend that's no good for you, or that boyfriend that hurts you, because you're afraid of what could be. And you just think, I know what I have here, so I'm just going to stay. That's why we don't face some of the hurts of our childhood. We don't work through that, because I know how to live my life right now. Why would I want to open all that stuff up? So we are content to stay in the desert. Given the choice, most of us would go back to Egypt. It's hard to move from the familiar to the unfamiliar. And here's the thing, if you know the story, then you know the result. God grants them their wish. He sends them back into the desert. He doesn't send them back to Egypt because I think, you know what? I think that's partly why he led them through the Red Sea, right? He opened it up, they got through, closed it. They can't go back to Egypt, or they would have. But they end up wandering the desert for the next 40 years. An entire generation dies before God tries again to bring the nation of Israel into the promised land. Did you get that? An entire generation misses out on the blessings that God wanted to give them because they were unwilling to step into an uncharted territory and trust God to take them into that territory. In Numbers 14, verse 9, the two spies that were not afraid to go in plead with the nations, plead with the leaders. And it says this in verse 9, and this is Caleb and Joshua. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Sorry, that's verse 8. And verse 9, only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. They could see that God was with them. And even though they were in the wilderness, they were not alone. God was with them. I don't know how, but it seems that somehow the nation of Israel had forgotten that God was with them. I mean, these are the people that witnessed the plagues in Egypt. These were the people that witnessed the parting of the Red Sea. These are the people who had the pillar of fire at night and the cloud of God go with them and lead them during the day. These are the people that God provided manna and God provided, quails to eat in the desert, in the wilderness. And so every single day they saw God's provision for them. And yet, even though that was true, they somehow could not believe that God could be trusted to take them into the promised land, to take them into the uncharted space of life, to take them into the unknown. What wilderness are you living in right now? Like, are some of you still living in a COVID wilderness where you're not engaging as you should, or you've had effects from COVID that are still lasting in your life, and maybe it's causing some fear in you? And you're not willing to step into what you know you should, what God might even be calling you into. Maybe it's a family wilderness, right? Like something's going on in your family. And you know it's not healthy, you know it's not good, but you're not willing to engage in it. Or maybe you're in, a wilderness caused by bad health or poor health or something that's rocked your world, and you just feel like you're all alone. Or maybe you're in a spiritual wilderness. You know that how you are living isn't the way it should be. You see, one of the things about wilderness living, it is a day-to-day sort of existence. That's what the Israelites were, reduced to. Daily, they would go out and collect the manna. Daily, they would get the quail. That's all they had to look forward to, right? I mean, they were supposed to be looking forward to going into the promised land, but then their fear takes that away from them. I mean, are you just living your life collecting paycheck by paycheck, and all you get excited about is, a few hours on the weekend? Hey, that's a sad life to be living when God has so much more for you. Wilderness living is like living in a dry and dusty place. It's not a great place to live, right? And yet we often resist leaving the wilderness because of our fear. Because our fear of the uncharted is greater than our discomfort in the desert. And no matter how much God does for us in the wilderness, for some reason we can't seem to trust Him to take us into the uncharted, into the unknown. And we're a lot more like the Israelites than we really want to admit. And unfortunately, for some of you who are listening to this, it is the next generation that is going to step in to what God wants for your family. It is your kids that God is going to call into the uncharted because you are unwilling to go. Be brave enough to break the cycle. Step into the unknown. Step into the uncharted that God is calling you to. You see, the kids learn the lesson and they end up going into the promised land. And then the nation of Israel gives us another example, but this is like 800 years later. So they've been in the promised land for 800 years, and then something happens to the nation of Israel. They wander away from God. They stop worshiping God, and everything is going crazy in their nation. And the Babylonians come and conquer the nation of Israel. And they take a whole chunk of them back to Babylon. And this is kind of like the story of Daniel. And here's the thing. Exile living, because that's what they were. They were taken from their land to live in Babylon. Exile living is a little bit different than wilderness living. Exile living is really, it's unwelcomed. Like it's forced upon you. Like no one chooses to live an exiled life. Like it's forced upon you. You have no choice. But it's also, exile living can be very confusing because what an exile does is they move to a place or are taken to a place where they're in a different culture. It's not their culture. They're in an unknown place where they're a minority. They don't feel comfortable. And they know it's not their home, and yet they have to live in that space. They have to try and make it their space. You see, exile living is really always a test of faith, and that's just a fancy Christian phrase, which means when God is asking you to step out in faith or test your faith, He's really asking you to take a step into the uncharted. That's ultimately what He's doing. And sometimes commentators, when they're commentating on the exile that the Israelites faced, they talk about two types of exile. The first was a spiritual exile, because you see, what happened when the Babylonians came in and they destroyed the temple. And so that temple was the central place for their religion for the Jews. That's where God dwelt. And so that was destroyed. That was taken away. They could no longer offer sacrifices at the temple. Like their whole system came crashing down. They were in spiritual exile. And then commentators say not only were they in this spiritual exile, they were also in this kind of cultural exile because they had to live among the Babylonians. And in this kind of setting where these people are far from home, everything is disoriented for them, and they're calling out on God, Jeremiah the prophet writes to the exiles and tells them a message from God, and it's found in Jeremiah 29. And let me just read verses 4 to 9. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Right? He tells them to go into this land and live. This is crazy, right? They've been carried away. They've been conquered. And what does God tell them to do? Look, make your living there a permanent thing. Build a house. Like that's permanent, right? Plant a garden, and not only plant, but stay there long enough to eat from it, which is usually months, right? Oftentimes to grow something. And then he goes on to marry and increase your family, like basically have grandkids. Like grandkids don't just happen in 2 years, right? It usually takes like at least 20 years. You have a child and then 20 years later or longer or maybe a little shorter, you end up having a grandkid. Like that is a permanent type of arrangement. That's a long-term thinking. Take the long view is what God is saying here. And then there's this shocking verse in verse 7. And every time I read it, I'm just shocked that this is what God tells them to do. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. You know what God is saying there? Other translations say, seek the welfare of the city. This is almost an outrageous command. Like these people have been conquered, treated really poorly, really badly, forcibly moved from their homes to this new location. And God is telling them, look, be a blessing to these people who've conquered you. Be a blessing to them. You know what? even though they have radically different values, even though the culture is very different, even though they worship Satan, even though their culture is overly sexual and hedonistic, you're there to bless the culture. You see, wilderness living, you shouldn't be living that way, right? Like there's something that God has for us that's better. But exile living is knowing that you have to live in a place that is not your home. That's what exile living is. And if you know your Bible at all, you know that the story of the Bible is this story of exile for us. It starts in Genesis when Adam and Eve sin and they're exiled from God's presence because we were created to be at home with God. That's why we are often unhappy with this life. We're often searching because there is something missing if we don't have God in our life. And so Adam and Eve are exiled because of sin, and we are exiled because of our sin from God. That's the story of the Bible. But it doesn't end there, right? Because God, in His mercy and His grace, gives us hope, and He provides a way for us to come out of that exile through Jesus. So God sends His Son to die for us, to live on this earth, to die for us because He was the sacrifice. And in His death and resurrection, the possibility of ending the exile actually happens. His death allows us to come out of a spiritual wilderness, basically into a promised land. And so that is the great news of the gospel, right? And if you think this exile thing is only an Old Testament thing, then you need to just continue reading into the New Testament. Peter, one of the closest disciples to Jesus, writes in 1 Peter chapter 1, he starts his letter by saying, hey, to God's elect exiles, exiles is the language he uses, scattered throughout the provinces. He goes on in the next chapter to say, hey, dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles. He views the Christians, the church, in his time as exiles. Paul will use a slightly different language in Philippians chapter 3 when he talks about our citizenship is in heaven, meaning that our home is not here, it's actually somewhere else. And so you have this idea and this understanding that the early church leaders believed that we were exiles here, that this wasn't our home, and this creates a tension. You see, what the tension is when you're living in exile, there's a tension to either want to retreat from the culture, like hunker down, huddle up, and just be on our own and not pay attention to the culture out there. Or the other side, the flip side of that, is that we assimilate with the culture and we become like the culture, even though we're supposed to be exiles there. And yet God's message to the Jewish people in exile in Babylon, same message, I think, to us as Christians in the world that we live in. You're neither supposed to retreat, nor are you supposed to assimilate. You're supposed to engage with where you're living, but always remember that that is not your home. And I wonder sometimes if we're just confused. God calls us to live as exiles. So God calls us out of wilderness living, right? Out of sin, but not into the promised land like the Israelites of the Old Testament. As much as we'd want to be in the promised land, He calls us into exile living because this is not our home. We are truly not home until Jesus comes back. God calls us into exile living, not promised land living in some senses. And I think because we live in such a highly developed nation and things are so nice here, I think sometimes we can get confused and believe that God is calling us into some sort of promised land living right now. And so we end up often assimilating with our culture and pursuing the good life, thing we looked at last week here. And it becomes a form of promised land living. And all the while, yes, Jesus has allowed us to enter spiritually into the promised land. But we would rather have the cultural promised land. We want to look like everyone else in our culture. We want to have the benefits of everything else in our culture. And yet God calls us to live as exiles here. So what does exile living actually look like? I think it's really like our vision statement. As we follow Jesus daily, as we follow where Jesus leads us, down the narrow path, which we've talked about a lot here at SouthRidge, what that looks like, we will intentionally take risks to bravely live outward. Meaning that we will be intentional in blessing where we live, the people we live, the communities we live in. You see, God is calling us into this uncharted space. And as we follow Jesus, Jesus doesn't ask us to retreat from our culture. He doesn't ask us to fear our world. He doesn't ask us to assimilate with us. He asks us to be lights in our world, to shine brightly, and to, be witnesses to others, to help people out of the spiritual wilderness of sin, to help them understand that this isn't our home and that God has something way better for us, to help people find the hope that they can only find in Jesus so that their spiritual exile from God can be finished. And as a church, we do a number of things, but so you may have heard, the food bank is one of the ways that we try to bless our city, to help people who are less fortunate right now and need that. We provide community funerals for people who need it at no cost. That is a way of, blessing our community. Our childcare center, the Brave Spaces, blesses families from our community. That's why we started a childcare center here at the church. There's so many other things that we do that God calls us as a church to do because we are trying to bless the city that we live in. I'm going to read you some verses that you may have heard before. They're actually fairly well known. And I'll tell you where they are after I read them. But this is what it says. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you." Some of you already know what I'm saying, right? Declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your hearts. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. Jeremiah 29, the same letter that Jeremiah is writing to the exiles. God gives a promise in there. And you see, the problem with these verses is that people often use them out of context. And they grab onto the promises that are there in the beginning, saying, this is what God's going to do for me, not realizing that these are given to exiles. Meaning that we are not living in the promised land, we are living as exiles. And here's the fascinating thing about these verses. In verse 9, which I did not read to you, it tells us, or verse 10, it tells us that the people who were in exile would be there for 70 years, meaning that the promise of being released from captivity, they would never see. They would die. It would be their children who God would bring back to Israel. And so the promises to prosper them are promises to live in exile and be prospered and do what God is calling them to do, to make homes, plant gardens, to bless the city that they're in, to pray for it. And he ends it by saying this, that in exile, I will be with you. Jesus echoes these words when he says to his disciples, when he leaves them, I will always be with you, right? If you're listening to this, you're watching this, I should be out of the hospital. Hopefully, if everything went well, I should be sitting at home, watching this online, enjoying this message just like you are. And I will be home from having my third operation to deal with cancer, to take it out of my body. And so this cancer journey I've been on has been a long one. And so it's given me a lot of time to think about life, about mortality, about, the in-between of all of that. And I just want to leave you with this one conclusion that I've arrived at living my life this way. Let me say this. I love my life. I am in no hurry to leave what I have, whether it's my family, my wife, the things that I'm doing here at SouthRidge. I have no desire to leave that at all. But here's the truth. This world is not my home. I'm an exile here. My true home is with Jesus. And no matter what happens to me, whether I'm healed through this or I'm not healed through this, on some level, it does not matter. Because either one of those is uncharted territory, right? And I have to walk the path that God has for me into the uncharted, into the unknown. And here's what I take from what we looked at today. I can do that. I can step into the unknown. I can step into the unchartedness of life because I am confident that God is with me. And that at the end of the day, I'm an exile here. And my true home is a place that I'm going to go to one day. I hope that's the same for you. I pray that's the same for you. Let me pray for us. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for today, and I thank you for this message out of the Old Testament and how the nation of Israel gives us such a great example of how not to go into the unchartedness of life and how to go into the unchartedness of life. Lord, I pray for those who might be in a wilderness right now, that they are either spiritually dry or they're just lost in their life and they're living day by day, and they know that the life that you have for them is not the life they're living right now. Lord, I pray that they would have the courage to step into what you have for them, even though it might be scary, even though it might be unknown. Help them to step into that, have the courage to do that, to place their faith in you. Lord, for the rest of us who are living in exile here in Langley or wherever in the world they may be, help us to remember we are in exile. This is not our home. And yet you call us to bless the place we live in. Lord, help us as a church to live out our vision of following you daily and intentionally taking risks to bravely live outward so that we can bless this world that you still have us living in. In Jesus' name, amen.